desert darkness outside Palm Springs in 1949, a young couple sped toward the sleeping farm town of India, the driver, already drunk and unhappy in his marriage, was the singer Frank Sinatra. His companion, equally inebriated and just out of a loveless marriage, was the 27-year-old actress Ava Gardner. They pulled over on a dusty side street, stepped out of the car, and began shooting out streetlights with matching handguns when the local police hauled them to the station. The lovers laughed and charmed their way out of trouble after the studio paid quite a bribe. A few hours later, Gardner walked into the house she shared with her sister, Bappy, and announced in her Carolina drawl that she'd had a wonderful time with the married man who would soon leave his wife for her. Those flashes of reckless romance, guns, booze, laughter, and freedom would come to define Ava Gardner's life. She was one of the great beauties of Hollywood's golden age, a woman with Andean green eyes and cheekbones that seemed to catch the light. She swore like a navvy, slept with bullfighters and presidents, drove Sinatra to near destruction, and lived life with a carnality and independence rare among women of her era. She was known as the most beautiful animal in the world, and her life was a deep, dark, and thrilling mystery. Before we revisit the triumphs and tragedies of this legendary soul, let me know where you're tuning in from. Get yourself a warm cup of coffee, find a quiet spot, and let's journey back to an era of black and white films and very colorful scandals to understand the woman who would one day be called the most beautiful animal in the world. We must first look away from the glittering lights of Hollywood and turn our gaze toward the red clay dust of the American South. Ava Lavinia Gardner was not born into royalty, nor was she a child of the theater. She was born on a Christmas Eve of 1922, a date that usually promises hope and joy. Yet her arrival in the tiny farming community of Grabtown, near Smithfield in Johnson County, North Carolina, marked the beginning of a life defined as much by deprivation as it was by destiny. The America into which Ava was born was a land of stark contradictions, while the roaring 20s were just beginning to swing in the northern cities, with flappers and jazz signaling a new era of excess. The rural South was already feeling the tremors of an economic earthquake that would soon swallow the entire nation. Ava was the youngest of 7 children, born to Jonas Bailey Gardner and Mary Elizabeth. Known to everyone as Molly, Jonas was a tobacco farmer and a sawmill operator, a man of the earth who worked with his hands. Molly was a formidable figure in her own right, a Baptist Sunday school superintendent who ruled her household with a strict, pious code of conduct. In the early years, the Gardners were a respected pillar of their small community. They owned their land and possessed enough timber to donate the wood used to build the local Sardis Baptist Church, their home, though lacking in modern conveniences like electricity and indoor plumbing, was the largest in the community, a symbol of their hard-won stability. However, the ground beneath them was unstable within 2 years of Ava's birth. Long before the stock market crash of 1929 would bring the Great Depression to the rest of the country, a regional agricultural depression struck the South. The price of tobacco and cotton plummeted, and the Gardner family's fortune evaporated almost overnight. They were forced to sell their land, the very foundation of their identity, and move down the road to operate a boarding house for school teachers. This was the first great trauma in Ava's life, a fall from grace that imprinted a deep sense of insecurity upon her psyche. The economic ruin of the 1920s and 1930s hit the Gardners with brutal force. The family structure shifted from independence to servitude. While her father tried to maintain his dignity by running a small sawmill and tending the grounds of the boarding house, her mother, Molly, became the engine of their survival. Molly cooked, cleaned, and acted as a surrogate mother to the teachers who boarded with them, enforcing a moral propriety that was as rigid as it was necessary for their reputation. It was this suffocating atmosphere of piety and poverty that would paradoxically shape Ava's later rebellion. Little Ava grew up in this environment of contradictions. She was a shy child, often retreating into silence. Yet she possessed a mischievous, wild streak that hinted at the fire within. She was a self-described tomboy, a girl who found solace not in dolls or dresses, but in climbing the boarding house water tower to gaze out at a world she could not yet reach. On one occasion, in a desperate attempt to retrieve her school books, she crawled through a broken window and injured her leg, a physical scar to match the emotional ones forming on her spirit. As the Great Depression deepened, the state of North Carolina withdrew funding for the boarding house, casting the family into uncertainty once again. They became nomads of poverty, moving to Newport News, Virginia, where Molly ran another boarding house, this time for rough-hewn shipyard workers, while Jonas took whatever scraps of work he could find. The air was thick with coal dust and desperation. Then came the blow that would shatter the family completely. In 1938, when Ava was just a teenager, her father contracted bronchitis and died. The loss of Jonas Bailey was catastrophic. It left the family grief-stricken and plunged them into absolute impoverishment without the patriarch. The Gardners were adrift. They retreated back to North Carolina, settling in the small community of Rock Ridge. Here, Molly operated yet another boarding house for teachers, and Ava attended Rock Ridge High School, graduating in 1939. These high school years were not filled with the carefree joys of prom queens and soda fountains. Instead, they were marked by a burning sense of shame. Ava was acutely aware of the class differences that separated her from her peers. While other girls wore new dresses, Ava wore hand-me-down clothes, a visible marker of her family's struggle that invited the mockery of her classmates. This humiliation forged a steel resolve in her. She learned to hide her vulnerability behind a mask of indifference, a skill that would serve her well in front of the camera, but damage her soul in private. At this point in her life, Hollywood was not a dream. It was not even a consideration. Ava Gardner was a pragmatist, born of survival. She did not look in the mirror and see a movie star. She saw a girl who needed a job. For a time, she enrolled in secretarial classes at Atlantic Christian College in Wilson, North Carolina. Her ambition was simple and heartbreakingly modest. She wanted to be a secretary. She imagined a life of steady paychecks. Far removed from the dirt roads and financial terror of her upbringing, she wanted security, not fame, but destiny. As it often does in the stories of the great tragic figures, intervened with a twist of pure chance. In the summer, Ava boarded a train to New York City to visit her older sister, Beatrice, who was affectionately known as Bappy. Bappy had married a photographer named Larry Tarr, a man who made his living capturing images of the world around him. It was Larry Tarr who looked at his teenage sister-in-law and saw what she could not see in herself. He saw the symmetry of her face, the depth of her green eyes, and the unique way the light seemed to caress her cheekbones. He took a portrait of her, a simple photograph that captured her raw, unpolished beauty. He placed this portrait in the window of his Fifth Avenue studio, perhaps hoping it would attract customers looking for similar glamour. That single photograph would change everything. It was the butterfly effect in motion. A clerk from Lowe's Theater named Bernard Duhan happened to walk by, saw the face in the window, and remarked that someone ought to send it to MGM Tarr. Seizing the moment, did exactly that. Back in North Carolina, Ava was preparing for a life of typing and filing. She had no idea that her image was already traveling to the desks of the most powerful men in the entertainment industry. MGM, the studio that boasted having more stars than there are in heaven, was quick to recognize the potential in the photogenic teen. They offered her a screen test, pulling her from the obscurity of secretarial school and placing her on a collision course with history. In 1941, at the age of 18, Ava Gardner found herself on her way to MGM's New York office. She was a girl who had climbed water towers in Grabtown, who had sworn like a sailor to protect herself, and who had never acted a day in her life. She was walking into the lion's den, armed with nothing but her beauty and a desperate need to survive. The dusty roads of North Carolina were behind her, but the scars of her poverty would travel with her, hiding beneath the makeup and the mink coats, waiting to resurface in the chaos that was to come. The transformation of Ava Gardner from a shy girl with a heavy Carolina drawl into a silver-screen deity was not a fairy tale. It was an industrial process. When she arrived in New York for her screen test in 1941, the machinery of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer began to turn. The test itself was a silent film in miniature, a testament to the studio's skepticism about her raw ability. The executives did not ask her to read a monologue from Shakespeare, or even a line from a contemporary script. Instead, the camera simply rolled as she was instructed to walk toward the lens, rearrange a vase of flowers, and turn her profile to the light. The decision to keep her silent was deliberate. Her southern accent was so thick, so steeped in the rhythms of the tobacco fields, that the New York talent scouts deemed it almost incomprehensible. She was a beautiful image with a voice that did not fit the picture. Yet, the camera fell in love with her instantly. The footage made its way to the desk of Louis B. Mayer, the titan of MGM. His reaction would become one of the most famous telegrams in Hollywood history, a brutal yet accurate assessment of her value to the studio system. He wrote, "She cannot sing, she cannot act, she cannot talk. She is terrific," with that contradictory endorsement. Ava signed a standard 7-year contract for $50 a week. She left Atlantic Christian College and boarded a train for Hollywood. Accompanied by her sister, Bappy, her mother, Molly, refused to let her youngest daughter travel cross-country alone, insisting on a chaperone to protect Ava's virtue in the city of sin. Little did Molly know that the studio itself would become the most controlling parent Ava would ever know. The first order of business for MGM was to dismantle Ava Gardner and rebuild her in their own image. She was sent to speech coaches who worked tirelessly to neutralize her drawl, smoothing out the rough edges until her voice became a low, sultry purr that betrayed no specific geography. They assigned her singing coaches to harness her rich alto, hoping to turn her into a musical threat. But for 5 long years, the terrific girl was nothing more than a decoration. She trudged through 15 uncredited bit parts in films like Babes on Broadway and Amulum Esquire. She was cast as a showgirl, a co-ed, or a decorative bystander. She was a prop with a pulse, placed in the background to make the scene look more expensive. During these lean years, the discrepancy between her public image and her private terror was immense. While the studio press releases began to whisper about her beauty, Ava was paralyzed by insecurity. She was so intimidated by the sheer glamour of the MGM lot that she was too scared to eat in the commissary. Actor Arlene Dahl recalled that Ava would avoid lunching there because she was terrified of running into established stars like Lana Turner and Greer Garson. She would eat elsewhere, alone or with the crew, feeling like an imposter in the temple of gods, to cope with this crippling shyness. She began a habit that would eventually become a demon. She later admitted that she was so shy she sometimes drank before scenes just to steady her nerves. Alcohol became her liquid courage. The only thing that could quiet the voice in her head that said she did not belong. She worked hard, taking direction obediently and watching how more experienced actors carried themselves. But the fear never truly left her. It was not until 1946 that the explosion occurred. Independent producer Mark Hellinger cast her opposite a newcomer named Burt Lancaster in The Killers, a film noir based on an Ernest Hemingway story. The role was Kitty Collins, the ultimate femme fatale. This was the moment the mask firmly acted in place. On screen, Kitty was a seductive chanteuse, a woman whose smoldering gaze and languid movements could justify betrayal and murder. Critics were mesmerized. Audiences who had never noticed the girl in the background of 15 other movies were suddenly entranced. Overnight, Ava Gardner became the archetypal film noir siren. She was dangerous, she was erotic, and she was precisely what post-war America wanted. But the studio's marketing machine took this success and pushed it to a dehumanizing extreme. They dubbed her the world's most beautiful animal. It was a label that stripped her of her humanity and reduced her to a biological specimen, a creature to be admired but not heard. Ava understood the transaction perfectly. She knew she was a physical piece of machinery. She was often valued more for her looks than her acting, and this knowledge ate away at her self-worth. She never pretended to be an intellectual or a thespian. She frankly assessed that she just walked around in front of the camera and looked pretty. But deep down, she yearned for respect that the animal label denied her. This professional frustration came to a head in 1951 with the filming of Showboat. Ava had worked tirelessly to prepare for the role of Julie Laverne, a mixed-race singer. She practiced her songs for weeks, believing she would finally be allowed to use her own voice. However, MGM executives, always risk-averse, decided her voice was not strong enough without her consent. They brought in Annette Warren to dub her songs. Gardner was furious. It was a betrayal of her hard work and a reinforcement of the idea that she was just a face, not a talent. When she recorded the song Bill for the soundtrack, the rich, smoky quality of her voice surprised even her detractors, proving she had been capable all along, but on screen. When Julie Laverne opened her mouth, another woman's voice came out. It was a perfect metaphor for her life in Hollywood, beautiful, visible, but ultimately silenced by men who thought they knew better. Even as her star rose to the stratosphere with films like The Snows of Kilimanjaro and The Sun Also Rises, bringing her into the orbit of literary giants like Ernest Hemingway, she remained trapped in the persona MGM had constructed. She played the Hemingway woman, tough, authentic, and tragic, because it mirrored the woman she was becoming. Hemingway himself admired her, saying she understood the art of bullfighting better than most Spaniards. But understanding the bullfight is different from surviving it. By the mid-1950s, Ava Gardner was a global icon. She had an Academy Award nomination for Mogambo, proving to the world she could act. Yet, the animal label stuck. The public saw a goddess who slept in silk sheets and drank champagne. They did not see the terrified girl from Grabtown who had to get drunk to face a camera, or the woman who ate lunch alone to avoid the judgment of her peers. The mask of the star was complete, flawless, and breathtaking. But underneath it, the scars of the past were beginning to itch, and the pressure of maintaining the illusion was building toward a violent release. If the 1940s were the years of construction for Ava Gardner, the 1950s became the decade of demolition. On the surface, she was the reigning queen of the box office, a woman whose image graced magazine covers from London to Tokyo. But behind the velvet ropes of the VIP sections and the high walls of her Hollywood estates, Ava was engaged in a brutal war on two fronts, one against the studio system that owned her body, and another against the men who tried to own her soul. The first enemy was the most insidious because it paid her salary, MGM, under the iron rule of Louis B. Mayer, operated less like a creative sanctuary and more like a feudal state. The contract players were property, and their personal lives were subject to the morality clause, a terrifying legal weapon that allowed the studio to suspend or fire any star whose behavior threatened the box office receipts. For a woman as spirited as Ava, this clause was a suffocating noose. The cruelty of this system reached its nadir in how it handled motherhood. In the golden age of Hollywood, a pregnant sex symbol was considered a damaged asset. When Ava became pregnant during her marriage to Frank Sinatra, she faced an impossible choice. The studio's standard practice was to impose harsh penalties on actresses who had children, effectively ending their careers as leading ladies. Fearing the destruction of her livelihood, and perhaps unsure of the stability of her marriage, Ava made the agonizing decision to terminate the pregnancies. She underwent illegal abortions, arranging them in secrecy to avoid the prying eyes of the press and the moral judgment of the public. She later admitted that she aborted the pregnancies because MGM would have destroyed her, but the emotional cost was incalculable. It was a sacrifice of her own flesh and blood to the altar of the studio gods, a trauma that would haunt her for the rest of her life and contribute heavily to the depression that shadowed her later years. While the studio controlled her womb, her husband attempted to control her mind. Ava's romantic history was a series of collisions with controlling men. Beginning with Mickey Rooney, she married the diminutive star in 1942 after he pursued her relentlessly, even interrupting a song to flirt with her while dressed as Carmen Miranda. But the marriage was a disaster from the start. Ava, still a naive girl from North Carolina, was ill-equipped to handle Rooney's compulsive gambling and serial infidelity. She divorced him after barely a year, citing mental cruelty. Though she refused to destroy his all-American image by revealing the sordid details to the public. Her second marriage to band leader Artie Shaw in 1945 was even more psychologically damaging. Shaw was an intellectual snob who viewed Ava as a beautiful project rather than an equal partner. He was determined to mold her into his idea of a cultured woman, giving her reading lists of dense literature and correcting her grammar in front of others. He treated her lack of formal education with disdain, shattering her confidence and making her feel intellectually inferior. Ava excelled in the courses she took at UCLA to please him, but Shaw's controlling nature suffocated her. When that marriage collapsed, she was left with a deep-seated belief that she was not smart enough, a wound that never fully healed. However, all previous conflicts were merely a prelude to the hurricane that was Frank Sinatra. Their relationship was the love affair of the century, a moniker that concealed the destructive reality of their bond. They were mirrors of each other, insecure, passionate, jealous, and prone to violent outbursts. As Ava noted, "When I lose my temper, honey, you can't find it anyplace. I've just got to let off steam." And he's the same way. The relationship began in scandal. Sinatra left his wife, Nancy, and their children to be with Ava, a move that turned the Catholic Church and the gossip columnists against them. They were branded as sinners, and the public pressure was immense. Even their honeymoon was a farce of privacy. They were hunted like animals by the paparazzi. Ava recalled a moment in Miami where, having lost her luggage, she walked on the beach in Frank's jacket, only to be snapped by a photographer lying in wait. She called the resulting image a sad little commentary on our lives, a picture of two people in love who could find no peace. Domestic life with Sinatra was a battlefield. His career was in a slump, and his insecurity manifested in suicidal gestures and heavy drinking. He would threaten to kill himself to get her attention, manipulating her emotions until she was exhausted. Ava, in turn, fought back with a ferocity that stunned those around her. The jealousy that ate into our bones fueled epic arguments. In one infamous incident, consumed by rage, she hurled a heavy marble ashtray at her former lover and lifelong friend, Howard Hughes. It scored a direct hit, knocking the billionaire unconscious. For a terrifying moment, Ava thought she had killed him, until he staggered up from the floor, bleeding profusely. This violence was not an anomaly. It was the language of her frustration. She threw a champagne glass at her lover, Luis Miguel Dominguin. The shards missing his eye by inches, she drove fast, drank hard, and swore like the sailors she had served in her mother's boarding house. She famously silenced the critic who mocked Sinatra's weight by retorting, "19 pounds of him is cock." It was a line that became legendary, but it also revealed her need to defend her choices with vulgar aggression, to cope with the madness of her marriage and the pressure of the studio. Ava turned to alcohol. She drank to numb the pain of the abortions, to forget the insults of Artie Shaw, and to match Sinatra drink for drink. She lived by a code of reckless romance, guns, booze, laughter. But the laughter was becoming forced. The high spirits were descending into alcoholism. She was trapped in a cycle of passion and destruction, unable to live with Sinatra, but unable to live without him. By 1954, the machine had done its work. The marriage to Sinatra was ending. Her body was scarred by medical trauma, and her spirit was fraying. She filed for divorce, a legal separation that would take years to finalize. The girl from Grabtown had conquered Hollywood, but in the process, Hollywood had ground her down. She was rich, famous, and adored by millions. Yet she was standing in the wreckage of her personal life, holding a glass of bourbon, waiting for the next blow to fall. By the late 1960s, the frenetic energy that had defined Ava Gardner's life began to wane. The woman who had once danced on tables in Madrid and shot out streetlights in California sought refuge in a quieter existence. In 1968, she moved to London, settling into an apartment at 34 Ennismore Gardens in Knightsbridge. She chose the city for its relative anonymity and its peculiarly English combination of emotional reserve and hidden appetite for debauchery. However, the physical toll of her high spirits eventually caught up with her. She had been a lifelong bourbon drinker and a heavy smoker, habits she refused to apologize for. In 1986, at the age of 63, she suffered a debilitating stroke that left her partially paralyzed. The most beautiful animal was now trapped in a broken body, though she was wealthy. It was Frank Sinatra who stepped in one last time, arranging a private medical flight to the United States for specialist care and covering her hospital bills. It was a gesture of love from the man she had divorced 3 decades earlier, proving that their bond had outlasted both their marriages and their youth. She spent her final 4 years largely confined to her London flat, tended to by her housekeeper and her beloved dog. The isolation was profound. Friends noticed that she struggled with loneliness and regret, haunted perhaps by the memories of a life lived too loudly and the silence that now surrounded her. The end came not with a bang, but with a quiet, labored breath. On January 25, 1990, Ava Gardner died of bronchial pneumonia at her London home. She was 67 years old. Her death marked the definitive end of an era of Hollywood glamour that was intimately tied to post-war fantasies and anxieties. There were no cameras rolling, no directors shouting action, and no studio executives to dictate her final scene. It was a starkly human conclusion to a life that had been treated as a public commodity. The woman who had slept with bullfighters and charmed presidents, who had been the fantasy of millions, died as she had lived in her heart, a solitary figure. Her passing was front-page news around the world, with People magazine bidding farewell to the last goddess. But in that room in Knightsbridge, the goddess was simply a woman finally at rest, in accordance with her final wishes. Ava was not buried in Hollywood among the stars she had once feared, nor in the Spain she had loved. She was flown back to Smithfield, North Carolina, to the red clay earth of her childhood. She was laid to rest in Sunset Memorial Park, beside her parents and siblings, completing the circle from Grabtown to global fame and back again. Over 3,000 people filed past her coffin at the Underwood Funeral Home, a testament to the enduring fascination she commanded. Yet, the service itself was telling. There were few celebrities at the graveside. The glitz of Tinseltown was absent. However, the press came in droves, hungry for one last story, and amidst the crowd and the cameras, a single detail stood out, poignant and heartbreaking. The very first floral arrangement to arrive at the funeral was a simple tribute from Frank Sinatra. Even in death, he remained the unseen co-star of her life, sending a final silent message to the only woman he, and perhaps the world, had ever truly loved. As we look back at the desert darkness of 1949, where a young Ava Gardner laughed and shot out streetlights with Frank Sinatra, we see the quintessential image of freedom. But if we superimpose that image over the silence of her final years in London, the contrast becomes heartbreaking. The tragedy of Ava Gardner is not that she lost her beauty, but that she never truly believed she had anything else to offer. She famously insisted, "I was never an actress. I just walked around in front of the camera and looked pretty." This was not false modesty. It was the internalized voice of a studio system that treated her like a physical piece of machinery. She spent her life trying to outrun the dirt poor girl from North Carolina, only to find that the faster she ran, through marriages, through bottles of bourbon, through continents, the lonelier she became. The reckless romance and laughter were armor, worn to protect a woman who felt deeply unworthy of the adulation she received. She lived in an era when female stars were expected to be docile, grateful, and compliant. Ava Gardner rejected that script. She flung it clean out the window, but the system punished her for it. The studio that controlled her career also controlled her body, forcing her to choose between her livelihood and motherhood. Her tragedy was the result of a collision between a free spirit and an industry built on control. She was a modern woman trapped in a feudal timeline, a liberated woman 2 decades before women's liberation became a movement. Yet, despite the pain, the alcoholism, and the lonely end, Ava Gardner remains a triumph. She expanded the possibilities for what a woman in Hollywood could be. She refused to hide her past, her lovers, or her truck driver language. She lived fully, with a carnality and independence that was rare among women of her era. Her story resonates today not because of a resume of flawless performances, but because she was real. She was the last goddess, yes, but she was also the girl who climbed water towers and dared to love the most dangerous man in show business. She paid the price for her freedom, but she never defaulted on the debt. So, as the lights fade on this Hollywood mystery, let us remember Ava Gardner not for how she died, but for how fiercely she lived.